if the US leadership has assured Russia that Ukraine would not be admitted to NATO, the conflict in Eastern Europe would not have erupted. Instead of adopting proactive measures to help end the war, the US and NATO continue to make choices that increase the risk of conflict in the near future. The question arises, if conflict occurs as tensions escalate, will Europe or the US be more vulnerable to attack? Clearly, the US allies have reason to seek a balance in the relationship between the US, Russia, and China. You are watching FBNC's World Affairs. After World War II ended, Europe was divided into two major military alliances, NATO and Warsaw Pact. Post-Second World War decades can be clearly identified as the decades of US domination over Europe. The US, being touted as an undisputed global leader, has been at the expense of Europe. While the UK continues to follow his master's voice, France and Germany have openly questioned US hegemony concerning issues that will primarily affect European interests. European nations' trade with China is yet another issue of concern to the US. Notwithstanding US concerns, President Macron of France has been categorical in asserting that the current global situation will not affect trade with China. If viewed in a territorial context, NATO is essentially a European organization controlled by the US. If the Russia-Ukraine war escalates, European nations will bear the brunt, not US across the Atlantic. It could have direct military and economic compulsions, which Finland will have to look into. President Macron of France is slowly but silently promoting the dream of moving out of US influence. His recent statement that France does not want to become vassal state in a testimony. In Asia, the United States had just raised its bet on strategic partnership with India and the Quad, a US ally, in a US-led world order. 2023 is seen in Delhi as the year of India. The country is hosting summits of both the G20, comprising the world's largest economies, and the China-led Shanghai Cooperation Organization. India continues to walk a tightrope in maintaining close ties with the US while retaining its strategic autonomy. During the visit of Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to India for a meeting of G20 finance ministers, she reiterated that the US is keen to continue friendshoring, shifting the manufacturing of certain critical components to friendly countries with India. This strategic technology partnership is obviously related to US concerns about China, which India seems to share. But India is unlikely to concede the US desire that India integrate its technologies with those of the US and shun Chinese and Russian technology altogether. As the chair of the G20 organization, India aims to reinvent multilateral mechanisms to shape the development model of countries in the Southern Hemisphere. Meanwhile, the Biden administration seems to have no choice but to acknowledge that India's diplomatic leverage and soft power may be useful for US objectives in a world that no longer considers the United States as the sole superpower. India is also involved in another US-led alliance in the Middle East called I2U2, established in October 2021 with 4 members including the US, India, Israel, and the UAE. I2U2 aims to promote economic cooperation in the Middle East and South Asia. However, recent actions by Israel seem to be drifting away from the US objectives. According to a foreign policy analysis, when John F. Kennedy was elected U.S. president in 1961, he broke from the agreement and sold the U.S.-made Hawk Air defense systems to the Jewish state, a decision that represented the beginning of the U.S.-Israel defense relationship as the world has come to know it. However, in mid-January, the Biden administration asked Israel to send these 1950s-era Hawk systems to Kyiv to help the Ukrainians defend against a barrage of Russian missiles and Iranian drones. The Israelis reportedly refused. It was a stunning decision by a country that has enjoyed more than $100 million in military assistance from the United States between 1946 and 2021. However, no one should be shocked by Israel's apparent decision to hold on to the Hawks. Since Russian President Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the Israeli government has played a double game, offering rhetorical support for Ukrainian independence and providing humanitarian aid to Kyiv and scrupulously avoiding any policies that will damage Jerusalem's ties to Moscow. The primary reason for this is security. The Russians have major presence in Syria and its airspace. For Israel to be able to go after the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or its proxies on Syrian territory, Israeli pilots need to de-conflict with the Russians. Even if much of the Israel-Russia relationship is about Syria and security, there is more to these ties. Israel's leaders almost reflexively define the country as both democratic and part of the West, but worldview matters. And as Israeli politics have moved steadily to the right under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's stewardship, Jerusalem has forged ties with countries that do not fall into either category. Political affinities based on nationalism, identity, antipathy to liberalism, and hostility to Muslims seem to have played a role in driving Israel's ties to a constellation of illiberal countries, notably Russia, Hungary, Poland, India, and Brazil. The press has focused a fair amount on Netanyahu's parochial interest in making changes to laws that would allow him to escape prosecution for corruption. From one perspective, that is the least the Prime Minister's partners can do for him in exchange for allowing them to alter how justices for the Supreme Court are chosen and providing Israel's legislature the power to overrule the country's highest court. This change could allow the government to expand Israeli control over the West Bank and firmly situate Israeli identity within a specifically orthodox version of what constitutes Jewishness. What is happening or may happen in Israeli allies with what has happened in other illiberal states, including Russia. Politicians have hollowed out, bent, and undermined institutions to lock in their power and pursue illiberal policies in the name of some ostensibly greater cause, notably nationalism, identity, and religion. It would be inaccurate to suggest that Israel is just like Russia, which is just like India, which is just like Hungary. Yet leaders in all of these countries share a similar outlook about how to organize their societies. So yes, it is true that Jerusalem's tie to Moscow are intertwined with its security concerns and the emergency that is Iran's presence in Syria. But for those who think of Israel as a Western-oriented democracy, its relationship with Russia and other illiberal states are much more consequential than that. Saudi Arabia is one of the most loyal allies of the United States. However, this oil-rich country has openly opposed the US on various issues in recent times. Late last year, Saudi Arabia Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman reportedly told associates that he was no longer interested in pleasing the US. He said anything his country would do for the Western nation would need a favor in return. Saudi Arabia is joining an anti-Western influence bloc formed by Russia and China in a sign of Riyadh's deepening ties with Beijing as the US pivots away from the Middle East. The kingdom's cabinet approved a plan to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization (SCO) as a dialogue partner, a precursor to being granted full membership. Formed in 2001 by Russia, China, and former Soviet states in Central Asia, the SCO is a political and security bloc of countries spanning much of Eurasia and has expanded to include India and Pakistan. The SCO holds an annual summit to discuss economic cooperation and mutual security, often focusing on terrorism, separatism, and extremism. though divergent interests limit a group's effectiveness. Member states are planning a counter-terrorism exercise in Russia this August, though the SCO is not a military alliance. In recent years, the US-China competition has become increasingly fierce. However, Beijing still faces many obstacles in its competition with Washington. The two biggest obstacles that can be mentioned here are Taiwan Island and the technological gap compared to the US. According to Eurasian Times, China's burning desire to annex Taiwan by force might, rather would, result in a direct confrontation with the US. The Chinese military, the Navy in particular, is ill-equipped to challenge the might of the US Navy with 11 operational carrier battle groups. Direct US-China confrontation has every chance of turning into a nuclear exchange. Therefore, China will move cautiously over the Taiwan issue. During hot war conditions to annex Taiwan, the chip industry of Taiwan will act as a shield because should the chip industrial infrastructure be destroyed, China's victory, if achieved, will actually be a strategic defeat. The second issue is the vast gap between technology. China is still miles behind the US in key military equipment development and production domain. China's AWACS program, in terms of numbers and technology, is in a state of infancy compared with the US. The collapse of the Soviet Union, a turning point in the global geopolitical landscape. Today, Russia wants a commitment from NATO that it will not expand eastward. However, the failure to reach an agreement has led to the outbreak of conflict in Ukraine. India and Russia have entered advanced negotiations over a free trade agreement that aims to build closer economic ties as most Western governments push to isolate Moscow over the war in Ukraine. The Indian Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar said the COVID pandemic has disrupted discussions between India and the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union on a trade deal. Jaishankar said advanced negotiations were taking place, according to the Times of India, while describing Delhi's position with Moscow as among the steadiest of major relationships in the world. It comes as Narendra Modi's government also holds trade talks with Britain and the EU, in a development likely to stoke tensions with the West before India hosts the G20 summit in Delhi this autumn. Trade between Russia and India has jumped since the invasion, despite Western efforts to impose sanctions on Moscow and to cut Russia out of global supply lines. Highlighting its willingness to trade with Russia, the Indian Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman said the country could buy Russian crude oil near or past the level of a G7 price cap on its exports, if OPEC's decision earlier this month to cut output increased global prices. Russia discussing trade ties with India comes as Putin's attempts to build closer relations outside the West, including welcoming the Chinese President Xi Jinping to Moscow last month. China and Russia vowed this week to deepen military cooperation after meetings between Putin and the Chinese Defense Minister Li Shangfu, also in Moscow. Following the Cold War era and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, the Western world, led by the United States, declared itself as the country supporting democracy and assumed the role of global leadership. However, it cannot be assumed that democracy is the solution for all regions, as each country will have its own unique characteristics. Nowadays, as the global landscape becomes contrary to a unipolar world and moves towards a multipolar one, nations need to find new ways to adapt and change accordingly.